Can I say something?
Perfect. Okay.
Emmy,
Yes.
you're very pretty.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being professional and
Okay. Oh. Why is it on this one? There we go. So welcome, guys. I will be hosting the Disabilities in Japan panel for today.
Why Japan?
It is my minor in school. I've studied abroad and done 2 different exchange programs in Japan. I went to Waseda University in Tokyo, so I studied abroad in Shinjuku and in Sugumo. I actually was able to take a Disabilities in Japan course under Kara Nakamura while I was there. She's one of the leading people in the disabilities field. Her specialty is in Japan, specifically in Hokkaido and up in the north. So I'm very passionate about this topic, especially in Japan, since I've had an amazing opportunity.
That's cool.
So before I wanted to talk about the differences of disabilities in Japan, I wanted to kind of give a brief overview of disabilities in general. So typically when you think about disabilities or when you see people talking about disabilities online, you'll see this quote very frequently, that the only disability in life is a bad attitude. The reason why you don't necessarily want to support quotes like this and have this way of thinking is because it's, in some people call it inspiration porn. It's because you're putting people with disabilities up on a pedestal and you're backing down all of the struggles that people with disabilities have. So it's important to remind yourself that disabilities are not something that make a person different than you. One of my favorite quotes from this comedian called Stella Young, she has an amazing TED Talk on this that I highly recommend. But one of the most frequently used quotes in the field is hers, where she says that the only disability in life is a bad attitude, and she goes in to discuss why that quote is bad. Because, no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs will ever change it into a ramp. So just saying, well, they just worked so hard. Well, they worked hard for the accessibility means to live out their daily lives. That doesn't make them any better because they were able to brush their teeth in the morning. It's just the daily lives for those individuals.
Ma'am.
Mm-hmm. I'm so sorry, I'm back. I know. Did you do that?
You speak with them.
Oh, can you guys not hear me?
I can.
Oh, okay, cool. So now we're going to get more into Japan. So it's kind of hard to define disabilities because it's such a broad term. In the United States, there is no legal definition of a disability. And we did not sign up for the UN Convention for Disabilities bill. We're one of the very few modern countries who did not sign this bill because we quote unquote believe, the United States believed that they have better disability bills and laws and that they're leaders in disabilities. That's a very debated conversation, but it's very different in Japan. In Japan, they have a criteria, like a set criteria, kind of like a DSM in psychology. Once you go to a doctor and get your disabilities signed off for, you get this little card that will legally allow you to get any disability accommodations you require. So there's some different categories for them. There's physical, psychiatric, and cognitive. It has more of a focus on social welfare benefits. So with this disability card, it's a little bit easier for you to get those social benefits such as welfare, financials, and to get those accommodations in schools. But there is some problems with this. Some people think it's non-discriminatory, so that it's a lot easier for you to say, well, you can't discriminate against me because I can prove to you I have a disability and you can show your card. But on the flip side of that, you have to get that card in order to do this. So you have to have the, the privilege and rights to be able to prove that you're disabled. And sometimes, disability, because it's such a vague term, you might have a disability that may not fall under those explicit criteria that the Japanese government has. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in that fact. Yeah, codifies under the categories. So, I already talked about this. It's very rigid. It's kind of hard to convince the government, like, well, can you give me these recommendations over others? I also briefly wanted to talk about the concept of normal. You will hear this term very frequently in the disability studies field. Normal is actually a very modern word in terms of disabilities and being abled or disabled. The concept of there being a normal body type and a normal functionality actually more so originated from the post-world modernism and consumerism. So back in the days when we lived on farms and stuff like that, if you had a physical disability, it wasn't that big of a deal. Like maybe you didn't have an arm past the elbow. That wasn't that big of a deal because maybe you couldn't harvest plants very well, but you could do other things around the house. Maybe you could milk the cows or do something else. There was a lot of wiggle room in what you could do. But once industrialization happened, then you have very set machinery and you're working on a conveyor belt at a very fast pace. So now companies have to decide, well, what does the average worker work at? What does the average worker have? What's the average person's arm length so that they can fit inside the conveyor belt and move at a very average pace? Because if one person works faster than another, the belt system isn't going to work. So because of this, now jobs have this heavy focus on being average, that you can fit those molds. There's also a debate that it wasn't just industrialization, but also war that brought upon the concept of normality in terms of disabilities, because even with the Industrial Revolution as well, both of these aspects brought upon not just the need to be average, but the increase of disabilities. So working in the Industrial Revolution was very dangerous. There was no regulations, and a lot of times people's hands were cut off, or they had asthma or any lung sorts of disease or cancers. So not only did industries and war require people to have an averageness to them, but it also brought upon more disabilities in the population. And a lot of people don't necessarily realize how common disabilities are. A lot of the times when you're on Twitter and such, people will ignore disability studies simply because it doesn't affect them. But in actuality, from the CDC in the United States, every 1 in 4 adults has a disability. So you most likely know someone, or you yourself have a disability. It could be one of the more physical ones, more easily to spot, but it could also be an invisible disability as well. So one of the things that Japan does really well, and one of the things that is a huge proponent in the field, is this idea of universal design or accessibility for all. You'll see universal design coming up a lot in the user experience and UI fields. It's a very new topic. And the concept behind universal design is these 7 keys. And the 7 keys are designed to make products and make environments that are accessible to everyone. Because when you're making something accessible to everyone, it doesn't matter if you're disabled or not, you can benefit from it, and everyone can. The goal is to make it so you don't feel excluded, but you also don't feel pointed out. So an example of this, the best example of universal design, is sliding doors. So automatic sliding doors are actually designed with universal design in mind, because they were actually originally meant for people with wheelchairs, but everyone uses them. I mean, I do. Sometimes when I'm carrying a bunch of groceries in my hand, you don't have the ability to open up a door. So sliding doors benefit everyone, and we don't use them thinking, oh, this is only for people with wheelchairs. It's meant for everyone. Same thing with straws. Straws were initially designed for hospital usages, but everyone now uses straws. So well, the 2020 Olympics were supposed to be happening, but they were pushed back to 2021. But Japan has been having crazy amounts of construction, especially in their subway system, most notably. When I was there, I think every single station stop on the JR line was under construction in some sort of way. I know Shinjuku was completely knocked out. There was like all the platforms were destroyed. But the goal was they were trying to make it more accessible because people have really called out Japan last time they had the Olympics, like decades ago, for the Paralympics, because the athletes couldn't find any hotels. They couldn't find any transportation to go. They actually had to pay a hotel to build wheelchair accessible rooms for them. So one of the big hauls that they had to do in subway systems is widening up the stations, like the slides when you slide into the subway stations, so that wheelchairs can go through them. This has actually been great. I love that they did these because now you can also bring your luggage easily through those tap and go slides. Additionally, they've lowered the ticket booths, so they're low to the ground, which is a little annoying. However, it's really great for those who are in a wheelchair because you can just slide into it and you won't have to reach and not be able to see the buttons. But I actually could talk about this for an entire day, but I'm not going to. But there's these things called the Daredemo toilets, so anybody toilets. And it's been a huge new wave in Japan. They're primarily only in Tokyo right now because they're more of a new concept, but they're considered the best toilets I think I've ever seen just because they include so much. So those toilets are in the center picture, and if you'll notice, there's a symbol of a person with a plus on it. I used to think it was for people with like invisible disabilities because they have those signs on the subway trains as well. But this one's actually for people who have had their colons removed. So if you have a colon bag, there is a separate sink in those restrooms. So you have your normal sink for your washing your hands, and they have a separate sink so that you can empty out. Yeah, I love it so much. Restrooms. So you can empty out your colon bag. This is actually a really huge issue for a lot of people who have had to have this surgery, because you have to plan your whole day around when can I go back home so I can empty out my colon bag. I know this is a really big issue, and I used to work at FSU's psychology department, and I was working on the CREATE project, which was all 65 years and older, and we had a few participants who had a colon bag, and we weren't able to host them for long periods of time because we had to work around the fact that our facilities didn't have a colon sink for them to properly and sanitarize their bags. So these toilets are great. They also have full body tables for adults. So if you need help with an assistant to change you, but you're an adult size, they have adult changing stations as well in these. But one of the biggest problems in Japan is currently the wheelchair commutes. I've done a whole entire presentation on wheelchair commutes from Waseda, and it's kind of rough. So I don't want to discourage people with wheelchairs to go to Japan. It's gotten a lot better, but there is a lot of research you'll have to do, simply because a lot of places have these, in the first picture you'll see, they have these little steps. They're very small. However, it can be a really big problem if you are in a motorized wheelchair because you can't get up these. There's no ramps. The reason these exist is because it's a very old idea, but you see it even in Western buildings. But the idea of having steps up to your store or shop is because it's elevating it. It's making it something elite, something worthy of entering. So when you think of the Capitol of the U.S., the Capitol building and the Senate buildings, they're up giant stairs. And when you think of traditional libraries, they have staircases leading up to them. It's because it's supposed to be a higher state. So a lot of times you will see these in Japan, especially if you go out to rural areas. So keep these in mind. If you're in a hand motorized, like a hand wheelchair, it's a lot easier to kind of push yourself up these, but be wary of these as well. But it's not all doom and gloom. Mark Bookman is my favorite person of all time. I've personally met up with him a few times, and he's an amazing person, but he offers accessible.japan, and it's an amazing website that goes through every single commute, where the ramps are in each station, and which temples to go to. He just finished, this is an old PowerPoint, I don't know if I talked about it, but he just recently finished his dissertation on temples and shrines in Japan. He just posted another published paper on it, and it's a really interesting article because almost all the temples and shrines in Japan have those stairs leading up to them because it's supposed to be the place of the god, so it's up on that higher realm. But there's a huge debate about, should we put in ramps, should we put in elevators and stuff like that, because is it destroying the history of these buildings? But by not putting in these things, you're not making it accessible to those who are in wheelchairs, or even the elderly, or sometimes kids, or even just anyone who has like knee issues. I know that a lot of the temples in Kakegurui are like really huge and long. Like one of the temples I went to, the stairs were like this big each. I was winded by the end of it, and I don't have any physical disabilities, so it's pretty rough, but he has an amazing website where he goes through all the temples and shrines that are accessible, so you can enjoy these when you visit Japan. I highly recommend his website. But I'll just briefly also talk about visual impairments as well. Japan is actually leaps and bounds ahead when it comes to visual impairments and accessibility. Most notably, when people go, a lot of people will talk about the train stations because they have little jingles. It's kind of fun even for people who don't have visual disabilities. I mean, I have my little line memorized. I loved it so much because every station has a different jingle, and when you combine them all, it makes a song in the circle. But the reason these jingles exist is so it's kind of hard sometimes to hear the talking of the station master over people talking, but jingles are a little bit easier to hear. So these jingles allow you to know which direction the trains are coming and which line they are. So you don't have to read anything. Platform doors, I don't think I have it in this slide, but in another one, they have two-way slide doors so you can't accidentally fall in, so it'll stop you. They also have these sidewalks. They're called tenji blocks or tactile blocks. They're primarily a lot in Asia, but you'll notice we have some of them in the States, especially in college campuses. They're the little yellow plastic things on the ground. They help people by they can use their cane on it and see where they can go and where they need to stop in case there's danger. So a lot of the times you'll see these near crosswalks, and they're just everywhere in Japan. They go all the way everywhere, not just on crosswalks. But why are there so many accommodations for this? Actually, visual impairments aren't that large of a community in Japan, especially compared to other disabled communities. The reason why is actually pretty fun. So back in the feudal era, there used to be these guilds. So if you wanted to work in an industry, you had to be a part of the guild, and only the guild could do those jobs. So the emperor assigned like who could be in what type of guilds, and actually the blind were assigned, they could be a part of two different guilds. They could be a part of this like folk singers. They were like bards and traveled around and sang songs. But their main guild was actually financial loaners. So they would loan you your money, and they were all in charge. They're basically like your bank. So they kind of had a lot of say in the government because they owned all the money. So there's a few interesting books where they talk about how they were scared of the blind man in their village because, you'd be scared of him coming around with his cane and beating you up for money. So they have a lot of power in the community, and it still lasts to this day. Obviously, guilds are not around anymore, but this kind of tradition has lasted in culture. Oh yes, here are some of these pictures of the dots and the tenji blocks you will see everywhere. They're completely everywhere. We had these even inside of my buildings at Waseda. They're just completely everywhere. You can follow the lines. They're great. Those are also the sliding doors as well. There's a two-way system for why they have these. So they have these because, well, this train is a one, but most of them are like connectors, so they have like gaps in between them. So it's very unfortunate, but sometimes people using canes will use their cane and hit it on the ground to see where the door is, to see if it's open, but they might accidentally mistake it as the door, but it's actually in between the two cars. So they ran into this problem, unfortunately, of people falling in between the cars and getting ran over. So they're currently putting all of these in place, and they're great. I love them. They personally make me feel safer too, so I love them. But they also serve another purpose of stopping people from committing suicide on the JR line specifically. That one's really bad. It happens fairly frequently. So these have been a really great implementation that they've been putting in, and you're starting to see them pretty far out too. I mean, we had them, I would say 2-3 hours outside of Tokyo too. When I went to rural Japan, we still had some of these, so they're slowly starting to show up everywhere, which is great. And just a little bit about hearing impairments in Japan. They don't have a whole lot of history of JSL, similar to ASL, where a lot of times there was no formal education. So JSL has a very mixed history. You don't really see too much information about JSL in terms of historically. Currently, they do have one university for JSL, but it doesn't go, it's a 2-year university, it's not a 4-year university. I think we have 2 4-year universities for ASL in the US. So there's not a whole lot on JSL. Most of the times, people used to send their kids to temples, and there would be little communities of people who would use JSL. Still to this day, there isn't really a whole lot of community for them. A lot of the times, your parents won't learn JSL, but this is true of ASL as well. Most kids who are deaf, their parents do not learn ASL. And this is true in Japan as well. So a lot of times you will see homemade sign languages. But as of recently, if you look at like 3-generational video types, you can see as the generations are getting younger, more modern, there is a lot more formality with JSL, and it's becoming a lot more of a solid language that's being actually taught to the audience it's meant to go to. So hopefully we'll see more for people with hearing impairments, because there's a whole lot for people with visual impairments. Every time you go to a crosswalk, there's a button that you can select, and it will make beeping noises. We have those in the US, but they're at every single crosswalk in Japan. And then I also wanted to talk about psychiatric disabilities, because I wanted specifically to talk about people who, if you're interested in visiting Japan, there's a few things you should do. You have to fill out forms to travel with medications in Japan. They're a lot more rigid on medications there. So if you're going for long periods of time, make sure that you know what to bring, that you have already pre-gotten it with your doctor and they have signed it. There's a Shokomei form you can fill out, which is what I have linked here. Yakashomei. And it's not that hard to fill out. I did it. They have in English and Japanese, so you can either language. I know a lot of people who don't fill this out and don't get in trouble with TSA or airport or the Japanese government. Everyone in my class didn't do it. I did it just in case, so it's kind of something for your peace of mind as well. Also, there's some great resources, especially I know Reddit can be annoying, but I do suggest Reddit sometimes for their I think it's r-Japan travel, I want to say. It's actually a pretty useful subreddit, and there's a form somewhere on there where people talk about autistics, and they list all the locations that have intense sights and sounds. So if you're autistic, there are resources online that you can find so you can avoid those areas that may bother you. I will say, though, there's a lot of pachinko. So it's like gambling. And those areas are pretty prominent everywhere. and they're very loud. So sometimes maybe make sure that you look on your Google Maps before you go around and search out for those pachinko areas so that you don't feel overwhelmed. A lot of times those pachinko places will have those automatic doors and they'll open and you can smell the tobacco and it's pretty intense smelling. So if those smells bother you, if you have asthma or a sensory overload for tobacco smells, watch out for those areas. Even in like the past 4 years, Japan's gotten a lot better about tobacco smells. It used to be like the first time I went, like 8 years ago, everyone was smoking on the streets. Everybody smoked cigarettes. But now you can't smoke and walk with cigarettes. You have to do it in certain areas that are blocked off. And most restaurants you go into, you can't smoke inside anymore. That was not the case 8 years ago. I would go into little bars and ramen shops and people would be smoking. That's not the case anymore, so you don't have to worry about that, which is super helpful. Also look up busy times for parks and entertainment areas because they change a lot. They're very frequent. Japan has different holidays than us, so make sure you double check those as well. And then kind of weird side note I wanted to talk about is Team Lab. Team Lab is my favorite art installation exhibit ever. You might see it's famous for the infinity rooms with the mirrors and such. Team Labs, there's 2 different Team Labs. Team Lab Planets, however, it also has the infinity mirrors, but theirs is more texture based. So you walk around barefoot and you get to walk around on different types of carpets and textures, and a lot of the rooms are filled with water and they have projections on the water. But if you're someone who enjoys textures, I know some people who are artistic hate textures, but I know some who textures is very stimulating to them. I suggest looking at Team Lab if textures are very stimulating to you, because this could be a really great experience. And then since we're kind of cutting it close on time, I'll just briefly talk about more intensive psychiatric things in Japan. So the average stay for someone in a psychiatric facility in Japan is 300 days. And while that might not sound like a lot to some people, that's pretty crazy, especially from a psych perspective. I think in the US, the average amount of days you'll spend in a psychiatric facility is like 4 or 5 typically, maybe a week. So seeing that most of the times it's 300 days is very shocking. You'll see that a lot of Japanese documents will be like, we're great at psychiatric care. Look at our numbers. We don't have that many people out on the streets with psychiatric disorders. It's typically because they're shoved into facilities and ignored. It's for long-term care, and it's an issue. But there is a bright side to everything. There's an amazing documentary. I think it's only like $8. It's done by Karen Nakamura, the lady I studied under. It's called Bethel, Disability of the Soul, and it's an amazing look into Bethel, which is a small city. It's not a city, it's more like a village up in Hokkaido. And everyone who's there has psychiatric disorders, more on the hallucinogenic side, so schizophrenia and stuff. And it's trying to look at disability in a different light and not necessarily more in a medical formula. So a lot of times they try to encourage each other and talk to each other out in the open about their disabilities. It's a very hilarious documentary. Every year they have a competition to see who has the craziest hallucinations of the year. One of the guys who won, his hallucination was that aliens were trying to take him, and he got the whole city wrapped up in this, and the whole city participated in his hallucination with him and encouraged him to move on past it and not view it in a negative light. So it's a very interesting and heartwarming documentary that I suggest. She also has a book that goes along with it as well. And then I'll also briefly talk about this because I know a lot of people are interested in the queer community in Japan. It's really starting to boom. It's been very silent in Japan up until recently. In Shibuya, it's finally legal for gay people to get married, but it's still very much stigmatized. It's very much a don't ask, don't tell. If you visit Japan, I wouldn't be worried if you are queer, or it's very obvious that you're queer. If you're a foreigner, it's fine. But in Japan, typically, it's not something that you won't get harassed or discriminated against, even if you come out as it. But it's kind of something that you don't necessarily want to talk about with your coworkers. It's not something that people outwardly speak about. There is a history of it somehow being considered a part of the disability fields in Japan, and it still is talked about. Like, a lot of politicians will include this on their disability platforms when they're talking about it. There was just a governor in Japan who had this on their platform. That's because it has a history in Japan of accidentally getting put on the DSM and it's staying in the DSM. And while that wouldn't, because we had it in the DSM too, and while that isn't necessarily a problematic thing, it's because they had those disability cards. So now you have people with disability cards from an old DSM saying, hey, I have a disability because I am trans or because I'm gay. You can't take away my disability card. So now, because of this, even though you can't necessarily get those cards like that anymore for that, you can't take away the old ones. So it still has this kind of loose connotation and ties with disability, and it's still talked about in the disability field, but primarily only in Japan. There is an interesting culture there with gay bars. There are a lot of gay bars in Japan, oddly enough. You would think there would not be, but there are, because there's this stigma of you can be gay outside of the home and outside of work, but when you come home and you come to work, you have to put on that salaryman persona. So you still see it a lot, and the reason really why Japan's being so slow about it is because of the birth rates. There's a lot of stigma behind being gay simply because of the birth rate, which is an interesting argument in itself, but not a good one. But that's why that still stays. Also because in Japan you typically have those intensive paperworks. Paperwork in Japan is horrible. There's no other way to describe it. So a lot of times when you have to do all these registries, it can be a pain in the butt to change a gender. If you think changing your gender legally in the United States is hard, it's a whole nother thing in Japan because they have different layers of formality when you speak. So changing how you speak in registries to everyone else changes as well. So it can be a big undertaking. Oh yeah, I had to step on for it. I didn't know that. I combined them. Oops. But yeah, the family registry is what makes it really difficult. And then a side note, because I know we're getting kind of close here, but I actually run a website on Tokyo Disneyland for disabilities. Tokyo Disneyland is leaps and bounds over Walt Disney World when it comes to disabilities. They have these little things that you can collect up at the front, and they have these amazing little wooden structures up at guest relations that you can ask for that show the rides. Oops.